The privilege of having been screwed over so directly and so beautifully by this system is the right to raise the middle finger to the institutions. Like, how dare you expect that I'm going to use your quiet procedures? If you think about what peer review is, it's the exact opposite of what peer review should mean. Peer review should mean that you publish your article and then the peers in the community review it. But in fact, what it is peer suppression. You take your article and you mail it off to somebody who you don't know. That person gets an early look at it. They might hold it up in review. They then inflict any changes that they want, or they reject it for reasons that make no sense. And then it's handed back to you. Now, why does it have such a positive spin? It's not long-standing in the community. It doesn't seem to have a very long history, but it came out of an effort to quality control new ideas. We wanted to know if new ideas were coming from reputable people. Were they using reasonable methods? Were they reasonably familiar with their fields? And in fact, that is the good reason that we had this new technique of peer review. Previously, editors had been tasked with being responsible for the field and figuring out whether or not something was up to snuff. In this new situation, it was perfectly constructed for abuse. In fact, what you find is that it's like what my brother refers to as the low posted speed limit in a southern town. The key question isn't peer review. It's how is it enforced for different people? That is, if you are a famous professor who is well plugged into a journal where your friend is the editor, you're going to have an entirely different experience with peer review than if you submit the exact same article coming from some place that is not well known to that journal and in which there is a bias against that group. For example, if I were to point out that every purebred dog in a kennel show is a product of intelligent design, that is, that humans have commanded canines with whom and how they can mate, that process has produced things like dachshunds and poodles. However, if I use words like intelligent design, I guarantee you that even though it's clearly true that dogs are intelligently designed, that paper will be rejected because there is a belief that we should have a line which says no paper on intelligent design has ever been accepted by a leading peer-reviewed journal. Now, that political understanding of intelligent design has to do with both a reasonable idea and an unreasonable idea. The reasonable idea is that you should not be able to smuggle Jesus into evolutionary theory. You should not be able to do young earth creationism inside of a scientific context. That is the previous reasonable version of peer review. It makes sense as quality control. But what happens when you start talking about perception-mediated selection? For example, pseudocopulation in orchids, which we've discussed before, or in the predatory system with the mussel Lampicillus, where the perception of the bass matters because it thinks that it's consuming a bait fish, but in fact, that's a fake bait fish filled with the young of the mussel. In both of those cases, you have perception-mediated selection, and you could make an argument that that should be called intelligent design. But those magic words can't appear in that journal. Why? For a political reason. So what we have is we've created a system based around quality control that in fact is rife and open for abuse. In that system, we now have to realize that we need other channels. We need an ability to route around. We need to be able to reinsert dissidents and people who do not get along with institutions back inside of the institutions. If you look at Noam Chomsky sitting at MIT, you will realize that it was once the case that such people were much more common. You can look up an old friend of mine named Serge Lang, and you could scarcely believe that such a person could have existed at Yale, but that person very much did exist. You can look at an old controversy about David Baltimore and a woman named Margot O'Toole and the courage of Mark Patashny and Walter Gilbert in fighting a Nobel laureate when Margot O'Toole accused a colleague of the Nobel laureate of misconduct, or at least irreproducibility of results. We have a long and storied history that has gone wildly off the rails with the crisis in current sense-making. And the purpose of the portal was always to set up a channel by which we would have enough people watching that we could attempt to keep people from being rolled in the alleys when they contradicted the institutions. And that is in large measure what we're here to do. If you look at our episode with Timur Kuran, we introduced you to a concept of preference falsification. Right now, the danger of the Andrew Yang and the Jeffrey Epstein situations is that they have conveniently communicated to many people, of course we're going to mess with your sense making. What is it you're prepared to do about it? This brings us to a final issue, which I think is incredibly important, which has to do with why there are no living heroes. In effect, we almost don't believe in heroism. As soon as somebody starts to make us excited about the world and what is possible for the individual, we come to start feeling terrible about that person, unless they're trapped inside of a Marvel movie or something like that. If you go back to the history of ticker tape parades, you will see that there were many ticker tape parades given for individual aviators, individual explorers, ship's captains who put their ship at risk to rescue the crew of another. And in fact, this pattern largely stopped. My contention is that the difficult case of Charles Lindbergh may have marked a turning point. In Lindbergh's case, he had flown solo to Europe from the United States and come back a hero, I believe, in the late 1920s. Now, Lindbergh was a very difficult human being to deal with because he was an authentic hero and he was also somebody who believed in America first and in isolationism. And given the Nazi menace in Europe, I think that's almost an unforgivable position. Nevertheless, the fact is that Lindbergh commanded tremendous popularity, and that popularity could have been used to keep the U.S. out of a war. What I find is that since Lindbergh, it has been very rare to elevate any individual to the point where they can oppose our institutions. The Pete Seegers and Albert Einsteins of the world, who fought against McCarthyism, were a huge danger to the industry that was cropping up around anti-communism. When it came to the Vietnam War, it was very dangerous to have popular entertainers like John Lennon who were against it. We have been frightened about individuals coming to rival our institutions in terms of power. And that's what's so great about the new revolution in long-form podcasting and all of these other forms of social media. Now, we have a great danger in that most of these platforms are mediated. We saw what happened to Alex Jones. It's quite possible that if these powerful institutions come to believe that a particular individual should be removed, they can always choose to enforce the rules in a different way. We saw recently the advent of terms of service changes to include dead naming. Now, if I say that Walter Carlos composed the album Switched on Bach or performed the album Switched on Bach, that is a true statement. But because Walter Carlos became Wendy Carlos, I have no idea whether or not I can be accused of dead naming. Imagine that you have 100 such rules that are never spelled out, never clear, that can be enforced any which way to deny someone access to the major platforms. This is the great danger with this moment. We have unprecedented access, but we also have a gating function which can be turned on at any time if we fall out of line with the institutions. I want to read you one tweet that has been on my mind for quite some time. This tweet came from a contributor to the Washington Post who's a professor at the Fletcher School. And it said, "Good morning, Eric." I'm going to leave out the parentheses. "So I've read up on a few of your notions and I have some thoughts, but my basic conclusion is simple. What's true isn't new and what's new isn't true." I think it's fantastic. I was stung by it because at first I was under the impression that we were still living in a world in which the Washington Post, New York Times, Harvard, Stanford, what have you, control the major conversation. But coming off of a recent date at the Ice House in Pasadena, which was a live gig with Peter Thiel, I've started to realize how powerful this new movement is. We can reach anyone, anywhere. What I now believe is that the gated institutional narrative has been spoiling for a fight. We are quickly coming to the point where we have a David and Goliath moment. We now need to try to re-inflict the individuals who are uncorrelated, who are not particularly good at taking orders, who don't like committee meetings, who don't want to sign loyalty oaths, but who are passionately committed to the public good and to some version of intellectual meta-honesty. We need these people to once again take up positions inside of the institutions. And I would like to, in fact, inflict myself on my favorite institution, Harvard University. The children of Harvard University have always been divided into white sheep and black sheep. And there's no question that I represent black sheep Harvard. But I also think that one of the features of the university that makes it great is that it has tolerated both its white sheep and its black sheep. It is time to do battle with the oppressive structures that have been used to silence new ideas. If in my family I assert that there might be as many as 3 revolutionary Nobel quality ideas in one clutch, how many ideas might there be suppressed if that is actually true? How many people are sitting on top of intellectual gold that never got its chance to see the light of day? What I'd like to do is to try to do battle with the disk, to show you that it exists, to try to figure out how it works, and to try to show that the tools that we currently have may be powerful enough to defeat it. This is the actual purpose of the portal. And I think even if we lose some viewers and some listeners, even if people start to see articles appearing that say how terrible the show is and how it's trying to foment some kind of unrest, to hell with them. We are in an amazing position to try to do something new and to stand up for a lot of people who may have given up on their own original ideas and to try to spark a revolution. Because if I'm right, the disk has been sitting up on top of some of our best and most hopeful ideas for a way out of our economic conundrums, our military problems, ideas which have some chance of delivering us to a much more interesting and brighter tomorrow. So I hope that this is going to be an unbelievable decade. Thank you guys for sticking with it. I'm sorry if this was a little bit long, but it was a lot to say and it was heartfelt and quite important to me to get it out. And we will return to trying to get you high quality content, either in the form of interviews, which you've become used to on the portal, or perhaps some new visual content that allows you to understand ideas that would be very difficult to communicate, but for some novel means of presentation. We hope to approach the community to try to coordinate people who are eager to contribute back into the program and maybe get a little bit of a closer relationship to our content going forward, maybe influence it a little bit. And we haven't figured out all of the bugs. So thanks for being part of the initial experiment. Thanks for sticking with us. And we're looking forward to being with you in the coming year and decade ahead. So you've been through the portal for our first solo episode of 2020. And be well, everybody. Stay tuned.